The sky stopped pretending to be anything but an accusation. It hangs low now, an endless bruise of ochre and copper that never quite lets the sun be a sun. Light comes filtered and mean, throwing everything in the same tired palette. Rust, bone, and the ashen white of things that used to be alive. When the wind blows, it drags a taste of metal across the tongue. Sometimes it smells like coal, sometimes like salt. Mostly it smells like old fires and old promises. Cities are memories with their teeth knocked out. I can still find the outlines of what used to be downtown if I stand on a ridge and squint. The skeletons of glass towers jutting like broken ribs, office blocks swallowed by sand, a freeway folded and half buried where cars once flowed like arteries. Rivers, real rivers, are cracked and split. Where water used to cut its living course, there are hollows of white salt and parched weeds that pop like brittle skin. Bridges lean against air, their cables singing when a gust hits. In the places the flood took, the water left its own scars, mottled banks, dead trees with roots clawing like hands. The mapmakers' names mean nothing now. We navigate by landmarks that are bones of our past. The weather has become less a backdrop and more a predator. Summers choke you until your voice is thin. Winters arrive like an afterthought, a brief, bitter correction that freezes what little grease and fuel you have left. Dust storms come up like armies, walls of granulated sky that erase the horizon and steal breath in a handful of seconds. Toxic rain is a rumor that sometimes proves true, a sickly drizzle that eats paint and privacy with equal appetite. Fires, the great, hungry kind, have a way of starting in a dead week and keeping on, a slow-burning fever that leaves hills striped with black. We learn to read the sky the way our grandparents read a clock, a certain color, a certain hush, and we know to shut the doors and hold our breath. Government is a phrase with no teeth. There are no national broadcasts, no coordinating flags, no emergency services to call. What used to be institutions have either withered or been repurposed into fortresses. City halls are now barter hubs patrolled by people who used to be accountants and are now armed with ledger-led resolve. Universities are scavenger camps where the library stacks are cut for firewood, and the data centers live on in battery-backed whispers. Scholars turned into keepers of half-remembered knowledge. Hospitals are for those who can pay or persuade. Those who can't are buried with ceremony at dusk by whoever is left to do the work. People cluster where resources cluster. Some pockets call themselves collectives, small, disciplined groups that traded the noise of freedom for the safety of rules. Their settlements are tidy, dangerous gardens grown around solar farms or deep wells. There are hydronests where people have kept a spring from dying, encrusting it with traps and treaties. There are caravans that move like slow animals, trading bolts for bullets, stories for seeds. And then there are the raiders, people for whom the collapse refined a hunger into profession. They wear other people's names like trophies and speak in terms of supply lines. Where, how, when. They move in bands and they remember how to break things quickly. Scavengers are everywhere, soft, persistent shadows combing the bones of our world for anything that can be made into leverage. They climb collapsed malls, strip houses of copper, and set up ad hoc markets where you can buy a jar of pickled beans for a radio tube and a promise. In the ruins of corporate campuses, ex-employees who once had ID cards and retirement plans now trade blueprints and battery cells like contraband scripture. Old laws are either jokes or blunt instruments wielded by whoever has the muscle. The postmarks of power are water, fuel, medicine, and the rare technical knowledge that can coax life from a dead generator. Some institutions survived in fragments that feel almost holy. The seed vault out by the far hills is a whispered legend to many and a guarded reality to a few. Its keepers suddenly have more leverage than any mayor ever did. A national archive, half flooded, half sun-baked, still holds printed things on paper that nothing digital can replace. Libraries have become memory banks where people trade stories the way their ancestors once traded money. In pockets, The old radios and ham operators quieted the silence long enough to stitch together small networks. That's how I found a voice in the static. The transmission towers that remain are like lighthouses, battered, crooked, and impossible to ignore. There are rules, though few are written down. You don't take water from a marked well without making a trade or offering a song. You don't enter a collective's borders with weapons unless you want to be measured and judged. You never trust a map unless it has been walked in the last week. Hope has taken on a currency all its own, rumors that spread faster than facts, whispers of green places and working pumps in communities that answer back. Sometimes the rumors are salvation. Other times they are mirages that leave men walking toward nothing but dust. And so the world sits, not dead, not alive in the old way, but in a hard, patient in-between. Everything we made is either being reclaimed or has become a new language of survival. The monuments that once said, "Remember," now say, "Beware." And the places that offered comfort now demand proof of worth. There is a nervousness that lives under our speech, a readiness. To run, to fight, to barter, to forgive, or not. I describe all this into a microphone because there are others out there who still listen, and sometimes the sound of another human being naming the ruined world makes it seem less final. For now, that's enough. They still call me on different nights. Not by name. Names have a way of eroding out here, used up like the soles of boots, but by the crackle and pitch of my voice. Some call me the voice, some the broadcaster, some say the man on the ridge. I answer by speaking into the same microphone I scavenged from the ruins of a public school radio lab and soldered back to life with 2 fingers and a prayer. The antenna leans at a crooked angle like a tired sentinel. The generator hums the same old song beneath the station's table. That hum keeps me honest. Before the world unraveled, I taught physics to teenagers who complained when their phones died. I ran a small repair shop on the side, fixing radios, mending toasters, coaxing reluctant engines back into grumpy life. I tell people that because it's the nearest truth to who I was, and because it explains why I could make this little island of signal last longer than most. It's also a lie I tell myself when the nights stretch thin and the wind pushes dust into every corner of my shelter. If I'd been better at fixing other things, maybe is a dangerous verb out here. It eats the present if you let it. So I try not to use it on air. Off air, in the quiet between keys and coils and the click of the tuning knob, the verbs multiply into ghosts. I listen to them and fold them into the scripts I read for myself. The scripts that say you can be useful, even when everything useful has been stripped away. Survival is a chain of small technical truths. You find water by following the green. The stubborn plant that refuses to die, the mossy line under a cracked wall, the way ants march toward a seam in concrete. You keep batteries alive by marrying small renewable tricks to old hardware. Solar panels scrounged off rooftop carcasses. A hand-cranked alternator salvaged from a bus starter. A car battery kept warm against the cold so the acid won't congeal. Food is barter and improvisation. I still know how to trap fish with a length of wire and an old paint can lid. How to smoke meat with the wet wood that leaches sap and keeps the smoke sweet. I know how to render fat into lamp oil. None of those things are glamorous. They are the language of staying. What keeps me alive is not the generator's noise or the careful rotation of crops in my meager rooftop garden. Those things keep me breathing. What keeps me moving is the idea that the signal matters. I learned that on a night when an entire convoy of survivors rolled in, blinking and sticky with dust, because someone on the road knows to listen for me. They followed a thread of static and found a small human voice that told them where to fetch water, where to avoid the raiders, and where to find a warm pot of stew in exchange for a wheelbarrow full of batteries. That night I learned that being a voice could be more than vanity. It could be a lifeline. The losses are a quiet, constant ache. I had a daughter, small, fierce, with a grin that could twist the world into something softer. She was 7 when the first winters began to bite in odd months, and the crops failed in a way the seed companies had not planned for. We lost her to a fever that came in a single night. We didn't have the antibiotics, and the healer in the next collective had left for the trade routes. I bear that like a scar you can't see. Some nights I try to talk to her into the static, and sometimes I imagine the radio waves carrying my words like a lullaby into a place where the sky is kinder. I lost a city too, the one I was born in. Where the parks used to be, there are now scrap heaps and makeshift forges. The places I used to wander with friends, the bookshop with the crooked sign, the cafe that seeded a scent of roasted beans into the morning. Those are all puzzle pieces I spend days piecing together in memory. Memory is a currency. A friend traded me an old coffee grinder for a collection of maps I'd drawn in the first grim year. Maps that still show streets where none exist. I keep the grinder. I keep the maps. I keep the small things because small things stitch you back into yourself. The human toll is not only loss but compromise. I have watched good people decide that to survive they must steal, and I have watched decent ones become cold enough to make a plan that would have horrified them before. Those transformations are the ones I read on air and feel like a ripple passing through my chest. I am not immune. There were times I lied to trade for medicine I could not otherwise afford. There were times I turned my back when a plea tasted like danger. Those choices sit in my gut like gravel, yet responsibility anchors me more firmly than regret. There's a moral architecture that survives alongside the ruin. We trade with codes now. Silent handshakes, marks left on doorways, small graffiti that say when a place is safe or when it has been counted for bodies. I took on the responsibility of keeping the station because there is someone somewhere who relies on a voice that will not patronize them. There are lonely people who need to hear the cadence of a human sentence, kids who need to hear a spoken bedtime story that isn't a rumor. I am, for them, the proof that someone else exists, that people didn't all vanish like smoke. Community for me is built in small, deliberate acts. I swap a radio valve for a teaching hour with the collective's new apprentice, showing a kid how to read resistance and solder without burning the board. I teach a woman how to set a simple wind turbine out of scrap, and she teaches me how to coax the stubborn soil into growing turnips where once only concrete lay. We build networks the old maps never imagined. People send brief updates on frequencies, snippets of classical music patched into songs, a laugh that sounds like a leaked sun. Those snippets become ballast against despair. But the work is not merely mechanical. Being a storyteller has become my tradecraft. You learn what to say on air and what to keep. You learn to anchor the news, who's taken the north well, where a storm will come in. Between small human truths that remind listeners they are not the only ones awake at 3 a.m. You avoid promises you cannot keep. You avoid naming places that will bring raiders like flies. You learn cadence, a slow line about the weather, a sharp line about danger, then the soft steadying tone that says, I am here. There are nights when I fail. The transmitter dies in the teeth of a storm, and I am a line cut off. A family once followed my schedule and missed a critical warning. They arrived as the raiders were leaving, only to be robbed of everything and rarely seen again. Those are the moments that scab into me and make me more cautious, more measured with the language of hope. Hope must be precise here, not theatrical. Still, there are reasons to believe other than stubbornness. I have found caches of seed that germinate when treated right. I met a small group that had figured out how to filter rainwater through simple charcoal layers and limestone. Clever, unglamorous science that keeps people alive. Once, a traveling mechanic taught me how to repurpose a bicycle wheel into a water pump that runs on nothing but human sweat. These are the kinds of miracles that make you feel like we might stitch a new life from the old bones. If I have a manifesto, it is this: tell the truth and keep your hands busy. Truth is the brittle thing we share, and the busyness is the muscle that keeps you from becoming bone-dry sorrow. I talk into my tin microphone because I believe voices can be the scaffolding for other people's lives. I hammer, I scavenge, I barter, I teach, And sometimes I cry into my pillow when the wind is sharp and the generator falters. Then I get up, rub sleep out of my eyes, and check the antenna. The station is not a rescue. It is a knot in a rope that still exists between people. Perhaps it is selfish. To be heard is to be affirmed. And I confess I sometimes need that affirmation as much as anyone. But more often it is the work of the living, of someone who refuses to let the last human sound be a sob swallowed by wind. I am a survivor who understands that survival is more than staying alive. It's about keeping a thin ribbon of civilization, language, knowledge, music, moving through the dark. So I keep the mic warm and the signal steady. And when I speak, I say what I can to keep someone else a little safer tonight. I tell them where the east wind will push the dust, what time the collective bell will toll for the ration swap. And sometimes I read a poem about rain that once smelled like home. If that sounds small, try living without it. Try living without the knowledge that someone else is awake, thinking of you. In the end, that is what I am. A man with tools, a voice, and a stubborn parcel of hope. Not enough to save the world, maybe, but enough to make tomorrow feel like a place you might reach. They called the year of the Great Silence a dozen names. The drying, the fall, the last summer. But names don't stop things. They only let us point at them and pretend that pointing means understanding. If you want the blunt truth, the crisis that sits over us now is a long, greedy drought that learned new tricks. It's not just a lack of rain. It's a system gone lopsided. Air warmer than it used to be, storms that forget how to be gentle, rivers that stop remembering how to run. And that quieted the rhythm every town, farm, and city used to depend on. At first it was simple. The rain came a month late. Then it came wrong, big, violent bursts that scoured topsoil into gullies and sent what little moisture we had straight down the drains. The springs slowed to a trickle, and the reservoirs drew down like people holding their breath. Farmers watched their crops fail in places that had been green all their lives. Wells went from a resource to a rumor. We learned to check the bank's ledgers and the mayor's empty promises, and then we learned to distrust both. The mechanics aren't poetic. The air holds more water when it is warmer, but the patterns that shove that water over a particular valley, the jet stream, the old ocean currents, have been pushed around by heat and melting ice. Those shifts mean some places get hammered in a single, brutal hour, and then nothing for seasons. Evaporation lifts moisture into the sky and plants, starved without water, stop cycling carbon and moisture back into the atmosphere. Wildfires, once seasonal, found new fuel in deadlands and began to burn hotter, creating their own winds. The black smoke they produced coated clouds with soot that actually changed how and where rain formed. Soil, when it is scorched and starved, stops holding water. It sheds whatever rainfall there is like a slick roof. The result is less actual, usable water where people are, even when charts say precipitation happens somewhere upstream. We also emptied the banks beneath us. Over decades, groundwater was pumped faster than aquifers could recharge. That cheap, buried water that fed cities and farms for a century is now a collection of voids. Once an aquifer's head drops, wells that worked for generations either go dry or spit up salty water that poisons soil. That groundwater debt is a cruel interest. When the surface finally does get wet, the water runs off and doesn't replenish the deeper store we thought was endless. What that means for everyday survival is simple and severe. Everything you relied on becomes harder and less predictable. Food prices in the old world became deaths here. A truck that used to bring grain once a month now may not come at all. Fuel convoys are rare and dangerous. Meds run low, and the small pharmacies we had left are scavenged or guarded by people who learn to close their hands tight. My community, what we call the Ridge Collective, grew out of a pump and a few people who refused to let the spring die. We fenced the headworks, set watches, and taught a code. Take only what you need and leave a mark. That code works until it doesn't. For every cooperative who honors the rules, there's a band that does not. Raiders learned the geography of thirst. They learned to time their attacks when the wells were low and the collectives distracted by illness or harvest. They don't travel with flags, they travel with speed and cruelty. The first time they came through, we thought they were traitors. They were not. They took our fuel, burned our spare seed, and left a warning burned into the road, an ugly sigil that some of my neighbors still see on their sleepwalks. Outside of collectives are caravans, hard-rolling groups that trade labor for supplies. They are less likely to stay and defend a place. Their value is mobility. They bring news and sometimes medicine, but they also bring disease. The pathogens that move with migration are different strains because people are weakened. Immunities are fractured by undernutrition, and antibiotics are scarce. That combination turned a bad cough into a community-level crisis on more than one occasion. Science, when you can hear it without politics, offers a sobering picture and a handful of ways to buy time. Heat increases evapotranspiration, the rate at which soil and plants lose water. So even if precipitation per year stays roughly the same, available water for crops can fall. Warmer air raises the threshold for storms, making them more energetic when they do come. Combine that with degraded soils and poor land management, scorched fields, overplowed ground, rivers straighten to move water faster, and you get floods that don't replenish aquifers and rains that bolt away in minutes. That's why we spend so much time fixing the ground, laying down contour swales, building check dams of rock and scrap to slow runoff, and trying to rebuild topsoil with compost and cover crops. It's ugly work and it's slow, but it lets water sink where it can be used. For the Ridge Collective, the immediate technical problems are the same as they are everywhere: water, fuel, food, medicine, and energy. Our generator runs on diesel that we siphon, barter, or find in the tanks of wrecked trucks. Diesel lasts longer than petrol and it stores better, but it is finite. Each liter we burn for radio or light is a liter someone else could use for a medical trip. So we ration. We ration like people ration tea in a different century. Batteries are precious. We learn to go off-grid by day and use hand tools, and by night preserve power for the most important tasks: charging a radio, running a small pump for a few hours, or preserving antibiotics in a tiny, insulated cooler. Energy efficiency became a religion. We converted all possible appliances to DC where we could: lights, pumps that could be run from a bicycle dynamo, and low-current fans. We learned to run only essential loads and keep standby power for emergencies. Solar panels became treasure, dusty, cracked modules, but panels nonetheless. We orient and stack them in arrays as best we can, and carefully husband their output. The math of power is boring and necessary: voltage, amp hours, charge cycles, and we treat every amp like it is a rationed loaf. Food is a daily calculus. We save seeds in cool, dark places, and we practice simple permaculture in whatever soil will have us. Microgreens and sprouts give rapid calories and vitamins in small spaces. I grow tubers in buried containers because they are forgiving and energy dense. We have a small aquaponics barrel that feeds 3 families with leafy greens, and a handful of fish that are more symbolic than filling. Smokehouses and salt curing are arts passed down from older survivors. Meat saved from a hunt becomes a century in a jar if you know how to work it. Fermentation has 2 miracles: flavor and preservation, and both keep people sane when ration lines get long. But the limitations gnaw at everything. Seeds lose viability if not stored right. One bad harvest and the seed stock shrinks. Antibiotics go stale without cold chains. Mechanical know-how is uneven. A town may have a brilliant alternator mechanic, but no one who knows how to fix a water pump seals. The social limitation is worse: trust. If you cannot trust your neighbors not to steal from your cistern, you either build defenses or you hoard. Defenses escalate, and escalation attracts more violence. It is an ugly loop. We try to remain scientific in our communications on the air. When a storm is predicted, by the old meteorologist down in the valley who still reads satellite images rescued from an old laptop. We tell people what to expect. A heavy band of rain now means flash flooding in our burned hills. We advise staying off the low road, moving food to higher storage, and waiting 48 hours before trusting water collected from runoff without filtration. That is not preaching, it's survival. Actionable advice became part of my broadcast because people listen, and because words are sometimes the difference between life and an ambulance of regret. I tell people how to make a basic solar still out of a plastic sheet and a shallow pit. Dig, line, place a catch jar in the center, cover with plastic weighted in the middle so condensation runs into the jar. It gives a liter or two a day, slow but steady. I describe a charcoal sans-ceramic filtration sequence, coarse cloth to remove grit, sand to trap small particles, charcoal to adsorb chemicals and improve taste, and finally boiling or chemical disinfection. I run through ration math, 2 to 3 liters of water per person per day, as an absolute minimum for drinking and minimal hygiene, more if you are working in heat. How to prioritize water use for children, the elderly, and the sick. How to rotate batteries and charge them to 80% to extend cycle life when replacements are scarce. These are small things, but they are precise, and precision matters. Beyond the mechanics are choices about risk. If a road has been reported mined or ambushed, we tell people not to go. If a collective is under siege, we suggest routes away from the choke points raiders favor. We never broadcast exact coordinates of our own pump. That's a line we won't cross. There are rules of radio. Warn, advise, but never lure. All of that operates against an environment that keeps getting meaner. The seasonality has gone blunt. A heating spike can wilt crops overnight. A late freeze can take the seedlings that survived. The insects change too. We have new pests. Beetles and moths that were once held in check by climates that no longer exist. And with them come plant diseases for which the surviving crops have no defenses. We experiment with companion planting, with neem oil harvested from an unlikely backyard tree, with ashes washed into foliar sprays, improvisations that sometimes work. Then there are the social crises that emerge from scarcity. Births in the first years fell because people understood what it means to bring a child into a brittle world. Some communities adopted strict rules about outsiders to preserve resources. Others opened up as an act of moral stubbornness, and both choices carried costs. Law became local. Justice became whatever the community elders could impose. That produces mercy in some places and cruelty in others. The immediate crisis that sits heavy on my chest right now is twofold and converging. The pump that keeps the Ridge Collective cistern from collapsing has a cracked seal, something I discovered last week when the pressure dropped and the pump's motor began to sing a wrong note. We can jury-rig a replacement for a short time, but the seals, rubber, nitrile, the sorts of things that resist abrasion, are not sitting on a shelf anywhere close. The parts lie in a warehouse 3 towns over, and the route to that warehouse is the very road that the raiders used 2 months ago. The collective council is split. Send a convoy and risk blood, or ration so hard the old and the young go hungry. Both choices are bad. Simultaneously, the satellite forecaster has been kind enough to whisper a different danger. A band of thunderstorms, the kind that carries lightning and a sudden influx of water, is moving in from the west. If it arrives heavy, we will see flash floods that could scour our half-built terraces and fill our cistern with silt that would choke the intake. If it arrives light, it will bake off and leave us hungrier. Either way, the window to act is narrow, so the work becomes triage mixed with planning. We patch the pump as best we can, slow the collective's consumption, and send 2 fast scouts with a small radio loop and a promise of barter to check the warehouse. I broadcast systems-level advice, how to divert runoff with sandbag cofferdams, where to put sacrificial filtration barrels to catch the worst of the silty water, and how to boil safely with shared stove schedules to save fuel. I instruct households to test rainwater with a simple litmus-style check. The old sugar and taste tests that aren't perfect but tell you if the water is briny or acidic enough to be suspect. There is urgency because the margins are paper-thin now. A failed pump or a silted inlet becomes not an inconvenience but a death sentence for anyone dependent on that water and too far from alternative sources. The crisis is not cinematic. It is the accumulation of hundreds of small failures stacked until they look like a cliff. Each failure pushes us into choices that are moral as much as mechanical. You decide who gets the last liter of fuel because you decide who gets to drive the elder to the healer. You decide who goes on a desperate run to a warehouse because perhaps someone else will die if the part isn't retrieved. That is why my broadcasts have become less a chronicle and more a call to arms, small interventions, careful instructions, and the occasional necessary lie. I will not call us safe when we are not, and I will not promise rain when there is only a shadow of cloud, but I will tell you how to make a still, how to mend a seal with a strip of bicycle inner tube and a wedge of epoxy, and how to recognize the sound of a caravan that carries seeds instead of bullets. Knowledge gets bundled into the night like tinder. It lights things if you care for it. If you listen tonight, you might hear me ask for volunteers to reinforce the terraces and teach a father how to ferment and store greens. You might hear me give the coordinates of a neutral trading post a day's walk away and a warning about the raiders. This is how the crisis works. It shreds people's lives into tasks, and those tasks either knit us back together or tear us further apart. We are balancing on the edge of both outcomes, and every day the edge sharpens. The rain, the pump, the raiders, each one is a thread. Pull the wrong one and the whole ragtag tapestry of survival might unravel. Pull the right one and maybe the rest of the threads hold. For now, we pull carefully and we listen. They wanted a plan. The council wanted a dozen plans, each one a different blend of hope and paranoia. I wanted one thing, a quiet night where nothing new broke. The universe in that small mercy did not cooperate. When the scouts left for the warehouse, they took the map I'd drawn with smudged ink, roads that sometimes existed more in memory than in asphalt, and a promise of trade, 2 barrels of kerosene, a handful of antibiotics, and a roll of nitrile tape. Jonas walked out with his pack tightened, and Mara with her cross-strap rifle slung loose against her back, the kind of casual weapon carry that had become a prayer. They whistled a thin song that I recognized from the market in a time before market meant barter under tarps. The song should have been small comfort. Instead, it felt like an offering. The first week after the scouts left, the small choices turned slow and jagged. Our ration line shortened by a ration of itself. Children's hair changed color as if the world stole pigments, not nutrients. The old generator coughed and coughed and coughed again like an animal with something stuck in its throat. Our mechanic, Raffi, swore at it until the swear words were the only language left he was fluent in. The rain teased the horizon with angry clouds and then went elsewhere, a temperamental god with no interest in us. Then the raiders came for the first time in months, not a full-out assault, not yet, but scouts on their own, quick hands and quicker knives. They hit a supply caravan just outside our watch. The caravan had been a bright thing, packed with seeds, and a crank water pump meant for a collective 2 valleys over. We listened to the survivors arrive, men and women whose faces had been rearranged by fear, and my throat learned the shape of grief all over again. One of them, a boy no older than my daughter had been, clutched a rusted tin and cried because the seeds inside were ruined. There's a sound in the world I remember now, the sound of a grown person choking back the words, "Please don't," until the air itself breaks. That night I sat at the radio and spoke into the microphone with hands that refused to stop shaking. I described the route the raiders favored, how they hit the east gate at first light when the watch was thin, how their mounts, a twisted mix of scavenged motorbikes and stolen horses, liked the low road because the churned grit concealed footsteps. I cautioned caravans to move by moonlight and not by star, because the stars were untrustworthy these days, and because raiders tended to trust the mapmaker who promised dawn runs. It felt petty to be precise about timing, but the broadcast had to be surgical. Every phrase might save someone. Then the rumor arrived. Rumors are a currency that floats faster than fresh water. It began as a fragment, whispered over tea in a tent, passed along with the clink of a spoon. There was a place, they said, a spring that fed a hidden cascade, a well that tasted like rain from a remembered childhood. A caravan had cut through the north and seen green in oval, green that moved like a heart. They called it many things: Blue Well, Greenfall, the Northworks. Every name was a prayer folded into a lie until proven true. I had heard rumors before: a working desal plant, a stash of unlooted antibiotics, a library with stacks still dry enough to read from. Half the time rumors were lies stitched from wishful thinking. The other half they were beacons that lured people toward the teeth. But the seed of that rumor burrowed into our bodies, into the council's margins, and into Raffi's muttered hours. If there was a well that actually worked, it meant a fix long enough to change our calculations. It meant time to repair the pump properly, to barter for seals, to teach the next generation how to keep the terraces from washing away. Trust is a small thing that corrodes fast. I have learned to weigh a rumor like a fuse, short enough to light the candle, not so long that it burns the house. We debated in the council under the dim bulb of the meeting room, the kind of room that smells like paper and old coffee. Mara argued to send a delegation, quick, lightly armed, to verify the rumor before we told anyone. We do not broadcast it, she said, because information is a weapon. Imagine we tell dozens of collectives, and then the raiders learn the route. Imagine the people who march in with numbers and take what isn't theirs. Jonas, lean and practical, wanted to send scouts and promises of trade, seed for information. Raffi wanted to wait and salvage the pump parts he could jury-rig. The old mathematician of the collective, someone who used to teach risk assessment for municipal systems, wanted a matrix of probabilities and a timetable. I wanted, selfishly, to believe that somewhere was a place that made the radio stop being a small comfort and become a conduit to something larger. The idea that a well could exist popped the grit from under my nails and made me think of my daughter's laugh as though I might hear it again in droplets. There's a peculiar loneliness to deciding on trust after a collapse. You look at people's hands. You see if they shake as though from cold or from a nervousness that is not appropriate to their age. You note scars, old ones that talk of survival, new ones that speak of violence. You listen to the way someone pronounces we. Does it mean an inner circle or does it mean the town? You watch for eyes that seek to take the shortest route to a gain. You lock doors and still leave a chair out because hospitality is the last thing that feels like humanity. We sent scouts. Not everyone agreed. Some people left in a huff, taking with them an old stove and a box of matches because they did not trust the council's choice. Others made quiet offers, 2 jars of saved honey, a patch of repaired cloth, to join the scouts as barter. The convoy that left had nothing cinematic about it. 4 wagons, a battered truck full of tools, and a handful of people whose faces I could name without thinking. I gave them a radio frequency to check in on and a note of code. If it's hostile, they'd play a short, ridiculous song on the fiddle to signal trouble. One no sane trader would play in daylight. Trusting others in this world is not a moral exercise so much as a logistical one. You trust because there are not enough hands to do every job, and because if you hoard all your skill, you die with so much unused in your chest. The scouts took presents and left with my blessing and a grim hope lodged in the middle of my teeth. The next weeks were a mosaic of small triumphs and sharp, private defeats. The scouts sent back terse messages. The warehouse had shelves half emptied, and a clever mechanical seal blocked access to the exact components we needed. A nearby collective had a man named Elias, an engineer who knew how to cut the metal without collapsing the rest. He demanded a price, 3 months' worth of rationed grain, and an agreement that his people could use our terrace water when theirs failed. The bargain made some in the ridge wince. Others nodded because sometimes you trade your pride to keep infants alive. Then the weather, always a bad actor, turned its face toward us in a way that felt like a verdict. The thunderheads rolled in with a sound like the rumble of an old tank. Lightning laced the sky in a nervous stitch. It rained long enough and hard enough to swell gullies and to wash the sugar-sown topsoil into the riverbed. Our terraces, half-built and hopeful, took the hit. The silt came in like a hungry guest and clogged our sacrificial filters. The pump we had bandaged with rubber and prayers shuddered and died under the strain. The cistern fell by inches toward a line we had marked as danger. I remember the night the pump finally went. I had been on air because staying silent felt like throwing a match into a pile of dry paper without warning anyone. My voice was a thin presence, whether reports, advice, and a lullaby thrown in because the children listening needed the cadence of a human voice. Suddenly the radio in my hand coughed and sputtered. Static. The small display flickered and vanished. For a breathless second the room was full of the generator's last, weary sigh. Then silence, an absolute animal silence that I could not name. People moved like smoke. There is a choreography to crisis. Who takes the buckets, who goes to the cistern, who builds the sandbag coffers. We ran with buckets until our shoulders screamed. Mara and Jonas came back from the north with burned boots and a face like someone who had seen a field of paper torn up. The scouts had been ambushed on the return. A small band of raiders had hidden along a weaving bridge and taken the truck. 2 of our people were hurt badly. Jonas had a shallow, long cut along his arm, and Mara carried a bullet grazed into the muscle of her thigh. They came back because they had no choice but to come back, because to disappear was to hand the town one more broken promise. The ambush set our nerves on a new string of tension. We had thought them quiet, thinking their numbers wane, but the raiders were strategic. They were using the flash floods like camouflage, striking when the collective was distracted with mending terraces and hauling silt. They took with them the kerosene barrels we had kept for emergency nights and left a marker on the road, a broken wheel and a spray of blacked rubber. The message was simple. We can take what you need and leave you what you think is yours. That night, I sat in front of the radio and told a story I knew might be risky. I described a false route, a decoy path along which there was nothing but an old quarry and a tangle of rusted cars. I broadcast it with the exact cadence of someone describing an attractive stockpile, and then I told a real message, under my breath, and into the feedback loop only the scouts would hear. If you can, take the back road by the willow, avoid the low pass, and if you see banners of black, do not stop. The duality of my broadcast felt like a lie and a prayer braided together. We sent a small party, thin and quick, to the warehouse with a ruse, false cargo, and a secret strap of money hidden under a blanket. They moved at night with the cool arrogance of things that had to survive, and they came back with a crate of seals and a single, breathless trader who claimed he had seen something else, something radioactive in the North Works, a machine that hummed like a bee and made water from nothing, or a trick of heat mirage and mirrors. The trader spoke with the same hunger as the rest of us and used the same words for it. Salvation, miracle, fix. But his hands trembled and his eyes were flat. The caravan's return was a double-edged sword. We had the seals for the pump. Raffi came out of his shack like a man reborn to the smell of oil and rubber. He worked, and the pump sang again for a time. The cistern rose an inch or two, and the children drank warm, sooty water that tasted like victory. But the trader's tale of a humming machine settled into the background like a new weather pattern, at once unbelievable and too attractive to ignore. It is strange how hope and danger live cheek by jowl out here. The more possible salvation seems, the more exposed you are. Word moves faster than discretion. The radio, my small, faithful contraption, become a double agent of sorts, broadcasting reassurance and sometimes bait. I found myself watching my own words for weapons. I would not say a place's name. I would not give coordinates, but I did describe the nature of the place in ways I hoped only those with sense and distance would understand. And under all of this, raiders, scandalous rumors, a hobbled pump, there was my private calculus of trust. Do I reveal everything because people deserve truth? Or do I hide details because the wrong ears will make the truth into a weapon? A memory haunted me. A convoy that once trusted my schedule and walked into an ambush because I had been wrong once about the numbers of raiders. That error echoing built a wall inside me. I refused to be the conduit of a catastrophe again. And yet, tonight, when a single voice from an old collective called the Ridge a light, I found myself answering with a map in my head, not with the coordinates in my mouth. The rising action is never cinematic in the way you imagine. It is made of small heated decisions, of people whose names you know, and whose faces you can draw with a blunt pencil. It is the decision to send a child to bed with one fewer spoon of stew, so an elder can have a swallow. It is the choice of whether to hand a caravan a tin of seed for a rumor of a humming machine. Each decision piles on the last, and the pile gets taller until it is inevitably tipping. I've broadcasted the truth, and I've told the half-truth. I have lied to protect, and I have lied to keep the peace. There are nights when those lies haunt me more than the dead do. Then there are other nights when the warm light from a repaired pump glows against the faces of children, and I convince myself that light absolves a lot of small sins. We are spinning into something bigger. The storm will not be the saving rain. The pump might hold, or it might die again, despite Raffi's burned hands. The rumor might be a mirage or a miracle. The raiders will press like a weight, and the caravan that brings news will also bring new eyes with hunger. I have the radio, a few friends, and the stubbornness that used to be called stubbornness and is now called survival. So we prepare. We teach, we mend, we watch, and we whisper. We brace for the next move. We wait for the scout's next call. And when it happens, we will listen with the same hunger we listen for any promise. I have learned that the heart of this rising action is not a single moment, but a layered buildup of small hurts and small victories that, stacked, either give us a ladder out or a trapdoor down. Tonight we climb, or at least we try. They called and I answered because that is what I had always done. Because the mic was a small, stubborn proof that someone else was awake. The night the world tilted, the call came in as a rasp, not a clear voice. Jonah's, breathless, saying two words that cleaved the air. We found it. I remember how the rain sounded when he said those words. It had started as a promise on the horizon and then decided to be a thing. Low at first, then an animal's cough that rolled across the hills. The storm did not come to save us. It came to test whether what we had built would stand when everything else tried to peel apart. Lightning stitched the sky like bad embroidery, and thunder answered with a low drum that set teeth to chattering. Jonah's voice cut through that, and I felt something old and feral in my chest. Hope, raw and blinding. The scouts had found the Northworks, he said, and there was a humming machine in the basement that still smelled of oil and warm metal. It was a condenser, he guessed, an old atmospheric water generator, something like anyone could cobble together under the right hands that could pull moisture from air and make drinkable water. Jonah's words were thin with exhaustion and sugar with possibility. There was, of course, the other part of the sentence he did not say at first. Raiders were already on the move toward that corridor. Word of the machine had a smell. People were following the scent. The choice presented itself like a knife with two edges. We could send people to the Northworks to try to bring the machine back, to hook it to our generators, and see if it made enough water to buy us time. Or we could abandon the long shot and focus on protecting the cistern, the terraces, the fragile nest of lives that had kept us going for months. Each option carried a calculus of death. The machine might be a miracle. The convoy might not return. The raiders might take the machine and learn to build more. The cistern might silt into uselessness, and we would watch our children thin like spindles. There is a particular clarity that accompanies decisions in the dark. You can see your priorities as if they were objects on a table. For me, The mic sat at the center. The voice had often been a lifeline. It had pulled caravans from the road to our door, diverted hungry hands, and coaxed people into rationing for a fragile winter. I asked myself if the voice would be enough this time. Could words steer a machine out of a place infested with men who had learned to take? Raffi, with hands like split driftwood and the smell of diesel in his hair, looked at me and said, "We can hook it, but the generator will be toast." There are things a mechanic says that mean 100 hidden things. This was one. If we took the generator, if we burned our diesel to power the condenser, we would have water. We would also be without the radio for days, maybe weeks. No broadcasts, no warnings, no lullabies. The ridge would be quieter for a price I could measure in liters. Mara was scarred with decisions. She had lived through ambushes and nights where decisions were made with mouths pressed around canteens. "We will lose the pump if the cistern fails while you're gone," she said. "We will lose the kids if you don't go. We will lose the radio if you burn the fuel. There's no correct answer." There never is. So we split the impossible into manageable cruelties. We would do both. A small team would try to secure the Northworks and bring the machine back, moving light and fast. The rest of the collective would reinforce terraces and build temporary filtration arrays. I broadcast short, sharp instructions, sandbag placements, where to place sacrificial filters, how to make a charcoal sand trap in a barrel. I did not say Northworks. I did not say machine. I said in code, the thing I had taught the kids years ago when we hid supplies in the library. If the bell tolls 3 times and the fiddle plays the wrong tune, move to higher ground and bring a jar. The radio was a blade that night. I used it to carry false signals for the raiders and real signals for our people. I made the decoy sound convincing, large, clumsy trucks, a tone of things that screamed easy pickings, then slid in the quiet lines that only our scouts would know by the pattern of breathing. I hated the lie I had to weave. I hated that the very thing I loved, my voice, had to be used as bait. We moved on wet roads that smelled like upturned earth and metal. The convoy I rode in was small. Mara, Jonas, Raffi, and me, plus 2 others whose faces were unfamiliar. The Northworks rose from the landscape like a reliquary, half swallowed in vines that had learned to climb concrete. The gates were ajar, and the place smelled of electricity and old ozone. Inside, the stairs crawled down into a basement where machines hummed like sleeping insects. The condenser looked like a monstrous, compromised thing, pipes like veins, a central drum that glowed faintly with residual heat, coils encrusted with a mineral scale that told of past water. A control panel flickered when we found it, prompting a hopeful, aching silence. Raffi touched the panel and swore softly, fingers moving like a priest. He set to work reading circuits and tracing the most likely path to recovery. I sat on a crate and listened to the storm above, thinking of my daughter's small hands and how she used to clap whenever I fixed something. The thought was a rope I could not cut. We had to move it. In the end, that was the cruelest part. You cannot drink a machine where it sits if a community is miles away and under siege. So we stole the machine in pieces. We took what could be lugged by human shoulders and strapped coils across the truck bed. It was slow, back-breaking work in a place where every movement felt like an invitation to an enemy. While we worked, the raiders arrived, drawn by the broadcast and by the scent of a prize. The ambush was chaotic and personal. Mara moved like a blade. Jonas took a bullet through his shoulder and kept moving. Raffi cursed at a man and bashed a fuel canister into a raider's face. I found myself in the midst of it as if I had always belonged there, shouting and swinging a crowbar because words only did so much. The radio, back at the ridge, squealed with a frequency pattern we had set as our signal of trouble, 3 long blasts, and I felt like a ghost cutting strings from far away. We won by a fraction. We drove the raiders off with a combination of speed, noise, and the sort of ferocity people only muster when they are hauling the possibility of life behind them. The truck limped home, a ragged procession under a sky that was no longer thunder but a thin, steady drizzle. We had the machine. We had also lost fuel, taken damage, and when we eased the contraption into the barn and hooked it to the generator, the truth of the trade fell heavy onto every chest in the ridge. When Raffi cranked the generator and the condenser hissed to life, the sound made you think of rain even as the real rain was still falling outside. It sucked in air, ran it over cold coils, and the first beads of water, small and trembling, slid down into a collection tray. A child laughed. I felt the laugh like a mirror catching light and wanted to cry so badly I had to sit down. The machine worked, in that slow and miraculous way machines work when the world allows them. We watched as a steady drip became a trickle, and the trickle became a first steady stream. We measured, liters per hour, amps drawn from the generator, temperature of the coils, salinity tests that told us the water was safe enough after a charcoal and heat stage. Raffi grinned in that feral way that mechanics grin when things obey. Then the generator coughed. The meter dipped. The diesel gauge sagged like a man collapsing from hunger. We had hours, perhaps, of power left. We could run the machine all night and fill cisterns enough to last weeks, or we could keep the radio limping and use the generator sparingly, preserving the voice that had steered convoys and warned of ambushes. The choice again. I thought of Jonah's son, the one who had come back clutching a tin of ruined seeds, and of the caravans who relied on my schedule, and of the nights when the radio's warmth had kept old hands from going stark with fear. I thought of my daughter and the way she had laughed at a radio show once, thinking it was a person in the box. I thought of how the ridge would be if the voice died tonight, quiet, fragile, easier for raiders to pick through. I thought of how they would be if the cistern died, thinner, a list of bodies in the morning light. "You have to do it," Mara said softly, when the generator gave that last warning cough. "If this works, it changes everything. There is a moral clarity to certain acts. You can be the one who keeps speaking, or you can be the one who gets people water." I had built my life on words, and yet here, in the press of diesel and metal, words felt like feathers against the scale of thirst. I made the call. We burned the generator. I fed every last liter we could spare into the engine, tuned it into a steady, furious song, and let the condenser drink. For hours we heard the hum of the machine and the soft clink of water into jars. We siphoned, boiled, filtered, and stored in a choreography that had the feel of ritual. People moved in a line, faces wet from the work and from the relief. We filled barrels, and then barrels became tanks, and tanks became something that made your chest unclench when you thought of it. When the generator finally coughed its last, it did not die with the dignity of a machine. It choked and let out a sound like someone giving up a secret. The radio went quiet. The hum that had once been companion became a memory. For a long moment after, the ridge sat in a sound like a held breath. Then a child began to sing. It was a small, broken thing at first, but others joined, and the song grew into something ragged and human. We had water. We were not in that moment saved. Not by a long shot. But we had a margin, hours, days, maybe a week, to fix the pump properly, to barter for seals, to teach someone new how to patch a coil. I sat in the dark with the generator's spent corpse at my feet, and I felt the personal cost like a bruise. The radio was quiet. There would be caravans who never heard our warning tonight. There would be collectives that might steer themselves into trouble because no voice told them to turn away. There would be those who believed in myth and marched and walked into the teeth of the raiders. That burden pressed against my ribs. I thought of the man who had once trusted my schedule and paid with blood because I had miscounted the raiders. I thought of all the small, precise lies I had told, and of the great, honest thing I had just done. The turning point was not a sudden revelation. It was the steady, unavoidable fact that survival was not my voice alone. It was hands and soil and machines, and the unbearable arithmetic of diesel and salt. It was the knowledge that sometimes the thing that keeps people alive is a physical pile of water, and not a sentence you broadcast at midnight. The voice mattered, and it still mattered. But in that moment, with the condenser dripping and children clutching cups, I understood that my role could change. I could be both, the voice and the hand. I could teach someone to operate the condenser and then sit back at the mic when we had fuel again. When the raiders came back in the night, drawn perhaps by the decoy I had made or by luck or by hunger, they found a ridge that was full of people who had hands and were willing to use them. We held the line. We used what we had learned, the prayer of traps, the geometry of ambush, the noise that turns a lone man into an exposed target. We bled less than we might have. We paid a price. So often we did. At dawn, the sky was sullen, and the earth smelled like the promise it had been willing to keep for one night. The condenser dripped on. The radio was silent for now. I stood on the ridge and watched children run with cups of water clutched to their teeth and thought, oddly, of all the things I had once taught teenagers. Physics, circuitry, the joy of making something whole. My daughter's laugh slipped through memory like a ribbon through a fence. It did not heal everything, but it confirmed something essential. To keep the signal of humanity alive, sometimes you must go find the source that keeps people breathing. This was the turning point. I had chosen to let my voice fall quiet, to burn a resource I had hitherto hoarded in order to prove one stubborn truth, that words save lives, but water saves bodies. I had given the ridge a margin. I had traded my solitude at the microphone for the messy, human work of bringing life into a place that had forgotten it. When the radio sprang back weeks later, repaired by hands taught at the condenser's side, the voice re-emerged into the static, but it was not the same voice. It had calluses. It had water in its cadence. It spoke with the knowledge of someone who had done the thing and paid for it, and it sounded, to my ear, like a better liar and a truer friend. We did not win the world that night. We bought a sliver of it. That sliver was enough to make us move forward, to argue again about trust and the rumor of miracles, and to decide who we would be when the music of the storm finally stopped. The mornings after the night we stole the condenser felt like walking through a house that had been rearranged while you slept. Everything was familiar enough to be recognizable, and wrong in ways that made you hesitate at the doorway. We had water, more than a trickle, enough to fill jars and to give the children warm bowls. But the cost of that water lay in the quiet that sat where the radio used to be. The ridge had a margin again, and margins are dangerous because they encourage planning. Planning means choices. Choices mean that someone like me has to live with the arithmetic. The obvious outcome was immediate and practical. Tanks filled, wounds dressed with cleaner water, the sick given a better chance at recovery. People who had been hollowing out from constant fear found room in their chests to breathe. The ration line lengthened by a ration of itself. The ration clerk stopped writing names with the furtive shame that had become habitual. For a few days, children ran like anything would be possible again. They filled cups and handed them to each other as if the act of passing water could be a prayer. But the consequences were not all light. Because the radio had gone quiet the night we burned diesel, a trader convoy that used to follow my schedule missed a warning about a bad bridge and a band of raiders. They took an alternate route and walked directly into an ambush. We learned of it the way news travels here, thin, late, with edges already blunt. Not everyone returned. We stitched the names into our nights and tried not to think too long about the small ways my choice intersected with the world's cruelty. That kind of knowledge sits like a stone in your throat. It reminds you that every action ripples. We also had to deal with the technical fallout. The condenser bought us time, but it demanded constant care. Raffi taught apprentices how to clean coils, how to scrape scale without cracking copper, and how to patch pumps with the kind of jury rig that becomes engineering when desperation is the teacher. Elias, the engineer from the neighboring collective, honored his bargain in parts, but not without taking his own cut. He taught 2 young people from our commune the basics of hydraulics in exchange for the grain. Those 2 teenagers now carry grease under their nails like a badge. Watching them is one of the clearest answers to why you trade pride for survival. New hands mean new possibilities. The morale shift was subtle but real. We moved from a posture of stooped fear to one of battered planning. People stopped guarding their doors with the same ferocity and started leaving a bench out on porches again. A bench is an invitation. It is a small democratic object that says, "Sit and be seen." Food-sharing circles reappeared on fewer nights. At first, because ration math had to be precise, but then more often as the water allowed us to cook larger batches without worrying we were wasting fuel. Someone started a small library in the rear guard of the barn, pages recovered from the archive that a trader had saved in a watertight case. We read aloud because reading aloud is a social act and because voices matter. My own head did not unclench as quickly as other people's. The radio's absence made a new reverence for speech live inside me. When the condenser hummed and the children's laughter filled the yard, I felt a complicated pride that tasted a little like guilt. I had traded the thing I did best, speaking into the dark, for a concrete pile of water. I replayed choices in my mind the way one might replay a recording, faster, and with the peculiar cruelty that memory has for detail. I thought of the convoy and wondered if there could have been a way to thread both outcomes without so much loss. There were nights I woke with my palms empty, reaching for the mic that had been my ballast for so long, and yet there were compensations I had not anticipated. Teaching became a way to atone. I trained 2 apprentices not only in radio maintenance but in rhetoric, how to use a voice to warn without giving away a location, how to craft a cadence that could send hidden signals to allies and false ones to predators. One of them, a young woman whose grin had the audacity of someone born after the first winters, learned a trick of frequency that let us whisper a correction into a public broadcast. When the radio came back to life weeks later, repaired with parts scavenged from miles around, and with someone else's clever adaptation, the voice that returned had been tempered. It spoke like a hand that had learned to build as well as to sing. Nature's response was, predictably, uneven. The terraces we had hastily rebuilt after the silt runoff began to hold more water as we refined the check dams and added charcoal barriers to catch silt before it clogged the intake. We saw tiny victories. A patch of clover that survived the floods and came back the next season. A stubborn willow at the edge of the stream that had been a sapling when the first drought started, now tall enough to offer real shade. Those are the kinds of things people in the ridge point to when the nights are long and ask each other to keep hope practical. Real recovery takes centuries in a world like ours. The small green is not a return to what was but a step toward what might be. We call it progress because, to live, you need language that contains a future. The social landscape shifted, too. Some collectives saw the condenser as an opportunity and began to press harder on the idea of shared technology. There were meetings, slow, formal things, about how to replicate the condenser, who would control the plans, and whether the knowledge itself would be freed or sold. The politics of survival are ugly and inevitable. Knowledge is now a currency that can be hoarded or shared, and both choices come with their own moral weight. I advocated for teaching openly. Show 100 people how to build a still, and you reduce the chance that raiders will learn that the knowledge itself is worth attacking. Others argued that making such plans public invites theft. We negotiated these things with more candor than we would have in the first years, their edges sharper, their stakes clearer. My internal landscape changed in ways less easy to sketch. The man who once believed his primary role was to be a voice learned he could also be a hand, a teacher, a poor mechanic, and a liar when the lie saved lives. Each of those roles stacked on the other until the old descriptor, broadcaster, felt too small. I had always believed that language could shape action, but now I had to accept that sometimes language is not enough. There are moments when transcription must become transportation, and you move from telling people to showing them. With that came an odd humility and a resurgent stubbornness. Humility because I had seen what my words could inadvertently cost. Stubbornness because I believed the voice still had value and had to protect it differently. Grief remained a companion. The names of those lost on the route we had failed to warn hung in the barn in neat lists. Neighbors, traders, a child who had liked to balance stones in a precise way. We buried them with a ceremony that was smaller than the dead deserve and truer than our capacity for grandeur. The funerals are where a community's moral calculus becomes most visible. There, people are honest about why they made certain decisions and about the cost of those decisions. The Ridge's honesty was not total, but it was enough to make a kind of peace. We did not sweep the guilt away. We accepted it as part of the work. There were practical lessons, too. We began to schedule broadcasts differently, short, concentrated bursts of warning and teaching, interleaved with checksums and codes that could mitigate misuse. We built redundancy into our communications so that a single generator's loss would not silence the Ridge for long. Elias and Raffi designed a small foot pump alternative that could keep a trickle running through the condenser in an emergency, reducing total diesel dependency. It was crude, inefficient, and beautiful because it made us less vulnerable. The raiders, for now, kept their distance. The night we defended the Ridge seemed to mark something. They tested us again 2 weeks later with a probing raid and were turned back by traps and by the strange ferocity of a people who had been given water. But that calm was not a guarantee. Raiders adapt, and the world is economically wounded enough that violence will always be attractive to the desperate. We lived with a wary optimism. The kind women pat into the hems of children's clothing to reassure them. What changed most inside me was the definition of duty. Duty had once been a theoretical thing I wrote about in lectures. Obligations to students, obligations to truth. Now duty was a set of concrete acts. Teaching a child how to solder, pushing a stubborn generator until your hands bleed, and deciding whether your voice should broadcast a lure or a lullaby. Those acts reoriented me toward the messy truth that survival is a community project, not a solitary virtue. My role broadened from announcer to organizer, from storyteller to a kind of crude civic engineer. The Ridge is not healed. The terraces still erode in places, the pump still squeaks, and the raiders still dream of easy plunder. But the falling action after our turning point was not a descent into despair. It was an accumulation of small repairs, of shared knowledge, and of the slow rebuilding of trust. We improvised water cycles, taught apprentices, and guarded the condenser like a newborn. We told more stories, careful, practical ones, and left benches out for strangers who passed through. When the radio returned, weeks later, it sounded different. My voice had a new timbre, one with the rasp of hands that had worked beyond spoken comfort, and the steadiness of someone who had seen the immediate cost of inaction. People called in with practical questions. How to build a charcoal filter, where to find nitrile tape, which compost mixtures held moisture best. They said thank you. They also asked for names of people lost to the road, and for advice on bargaining with engineers. The inquiries were all practical. They wanted tools and plans, not oratory. Sitting at the mic that first night back, I read a list of supplies we would need for repairs, and then, after a pause that felt like prayer, I read a poem about rain. It was small and not very good, but someone called it beautiful, perhaps because we had earned the right to be sentimental in small doses. In the end, the aftermath of the climax taught us something old dressed as new. Survival is not a single leap, but a slow collection of steady acts. The condenser did not save the world. It saved enough people to make repair feasible. It changed the trade-offs we had to make and taught us that the voice matters but must sometimes share the stage with work. We left the radio on more carefully, taught more people how to fix things, and planted more trees than we burned. That was the trade-off we could live with. Now, as the season leans toward another uncertain summer, I listen to the Ridge in the thin hours of dawn. Children race with cups. The willow shades a bench. The condenser drips faithfully in its corner, tended by hands younger and steadier than mine. The radio carries my voice again, but it is a voice tempered by salt and effort, a voice that knows the smell of regret and the economy of mercy. We are not beyond grief, nor are we safe. We are simply still trying, and perhaps that is the only honest definition of hope we have left. The morning we decided hope was worth measuring, I stepped outside and watched a child fill a cup at the condenser. She held it like something holy, two hands cupped around a small silver vessel, and walked toward the other children as if she carried a secret. When she handed it over, the receiving child blinked, not quite sure that the world still made such mercies. Their faces told me what my speeches never could. Survival shows up in small transactions, in the passing of a cup, in the moment when you are given something without having to bargain for it. Hope is fragile. It cracks from the inside. It bends under the weight of choices you make with your hands and keeps you awake at night. I have learned that hope is not a banner you unfurl in the square. It is a ledger, a set of agreements, a taught skill, and a handful of water. The condenser gave us a margin. That margin is not a miracle. It's a series of tiny human inventions, coils cleaned with old toothbrushes, filters layered with sand and charcoal, hands that did not ask for glory. That margin shifts the arithmetic of survival by narrow increments. Those increments matter because they create time. Time to fix, time to teach, time to grieve. There are nights I still hear the radio in my sleep. Not the words, but the cadence of it, a rhythm I learned to depend on. That cadence has changed. It has calluses now. When I speak, I am more careful. I know that words can guide and mislead. I know that a sentence can save a convoy or steer them into an ambush. I have learned to keep certain things close and to give away others freely. How to make a still, how to stretch batteries longer, how to read the smell of soil. I give practical things now because they keep bodies breathing. I keep the stories too because we need maps for the heart as well as maps for the road. The world did not reset. The terraces still bear patches. The pump still hiccups on bad days. The raiders still watch roads like wolves watch a herd. But there is a difference between surviving and merely existing. And we sometimes cross that line because someone showed another how to solder a broken connection, or how to read a barometer born out of a canned thermostat. We have learned to make redundancy our religion. 2 radios, 3 methods of filtration, and the habit of teaching apprentices not only how to keep things running, but why those things matter. Teach someone a trick, and you have multiplied your chances of waking to another sunrise. Loss is always in the room. I sit with it like a partner who will not leave. I have names I carry in my pockets. Traders who never came home, the convoy who trusted my schedule and paid, someone's child who liked to stack stones into perfect towers. The guilt from choices I made, choices that saved some and exposed others, will not dissolve with water. It gathers in the quiet like dust. But grief also teaches a certain carefulness. It taught me to ask whether an instruction on air might be used as bait, to code warnings into songs, and to make my lullabies into signals that keep the foolish and the desperate from marching straight into harm. If there is a lesson I would hand to anyone who hears me now, it is this: build hands as well as voices. Words will rally us and comfort us, but hands will make the world drinkable. Teach someone how to fix a pump. Show a child how to make charcoal filters. Leave a bench out on your porch and sit with a stranger. Share plans even when the cost seems high. Knowledge decentralized is knowledge you cannot be forced to barter away at knife point. Keep redundancy in everything. Multiple ways of boiling, of filtering, of communicating. Treat hope like a fragile thing, yes, but also like a resource to be stewarded. I do not offer false endings. There will be more storms, more silt, more nights when the radio is dead and the generator will cough its last. There will be times when we count losses like inventory and find the column long, but there will also be mornings like this one. A bench on a porch, a willow keeping stubborn watch over a bank, a child carrying water with the solemnity of ritual. Those mornings, when they happen, ask us to continue the tiny, stubborn work of being human. Prepare for the future the way people patch a roof, not because the sky always threatens to fall, but because you know the leaks will come. Store seeds correctly. Teach a neighbor what you can do without. Barter for knowledge the way you barter for coal. Keep a spare radio battery hidden in more than one place. Teach someone to read a weather pattern. If you have a machine that can turn air into water, do not hoard the plans. Train 3 people so the knowledge survives accidents and bad luck. We learned the hard way that centralizing hope in a single voice or a single generator is asking too much of one fragile thing. This is not a sermon. It is not a rallying cry for heroics. It is a pragmatic plea from a man who has watched both the high cost of isolation and the small, practical miracles of shared labor. If you can, teach. If you can, share. If you must choose between speaking and bringing water tonight, consider who will wake tomorrow because of your choice. There will be no one-size-fits-all answer. There are only weights and measures and the courage to weigh them. As for me, I will continue to keep the mic warm and the tools within reach. I will repair what I can and teach what I must. I will sing when that is what people need and hand a wrench when that is what the world asks for. I will tell the truth as best I can, and I will hide the smallest and most dangerous truths when the cost of telling them is blood. If you hear my voice out there, if the static ever becomes a friend again, know this. Stay alive, keep learning, and find someone to teach. Keep benches out. Keep seeds in cool, dark places. Make a habit of redundancy. Remember names. Forgive yourselves the small, human compromises you must make to live, but do not let those compromises calcify into cruelties. I do not know how long this sliver of time we have bought will last. I do not know whether the Northworks will be a model for others or a prize that brings more wolves to the table. I only know that tonight, in the hush after the children have slept and the condenser drips like an ember at the end of a fire, the ridge breathes more easily. That breath is not the world returned. It is a decision to act, to teach, to share, and to keep speaking, sometimes quietly, sometimes not at all, so that others can do the same. So, if you are out there and listening on a cracked receiver or a borrowed battery, this is what I ask. Be careful with hope, but do not be stingy with it. Make yourself useful. Teach someone, fix something, pass along a seed. Keep a voice alive in your throat if you can, and keep hands busy if you cannot. The world may be a ruin, but ruins can shelter new things. We will not be saved by a prophecy. We will be saved by the patient daily work of each other. Stay alive. Stay human. Keep the bench out.